All right, well, thanks to Dr. Olesen for a very kind introduction. Thanks to my friend Chris, thanks to all of you for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces, and it's a really great pleasure to be here. We live locally, and I'm always happy to help out the college in whatever way I can. We really admire what you're doing up here, and we're happy that you're doing it. All right, so I thought today I would share with you some of the ideas from a book I've been working on. It's been about 3 years in the making. The title of the book is The Nature of the Sexes, and what I was going to do was brag about how surely I set some record for the number of saints on the cover of a contemporary analytic philosophy book. So you can't really tell, but St. Michael's there. This is St. Joan of Arc, by the way, and then St. Michael's behind her, and St. Catherine of Alexandria is there as well. So I was really pumped about that. I was excited that the publisher let me choose this as a cover. But then I come to find out, some people have already received the book. I'm not one of those people. But some people have already received the book, and apparently the publisher kind of shifted the focus. You can still see St. Michael's sword, which I think is pretty cool. But yeah, I wish they were still on the cover. But St. Joan of Arc is there, and that means a lot to me. If you could ask her to pray for me, I would sure appreciate that. I thought it was fitting that she be on the cover. Maybe you already know this, but she was ultimately executed for wearing pants. That's what the English got her on, for wearing pants. So I don't know what happens if you violate the dress code here at TAC, but it's probably not that bad. All right, so you should have gotten a handout. I hope you got a handout. If you didn't get a handout, it might be too late. But the handout has the outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start talking about what the sexes could not be. So I'm interested in what it is to be male and what it is to be female. And in a second, I'll tell you why that interests me and why I think it's important. But we'll start by saying what they could not be. And I'll interact with some thinkers who defend views like these. So I'll explain why I think these are wrong. Then I'll tell you what I think the sexes are, what they must be. So that's when I'll give you what I'm calling a Neo-Aristotelian account of the sexes. It's going to be a higher order functional account, so I'll try to tell you what I mean by that. And then we'll go through a litany of objections here. We'll think about embryos and juveniles and various kinds of hermaphrodites and other species. We'll think about so-called intersex conditions, disorders of sexual development, and then that'll be it. And then I think we have a Q&A. And so I just wanted to tell you that there's plenty more to talk about. I have you only for about 50 minutes, but there's going to be a lot more to talk about. We could talk about these questions, for example, is sex binary? Is sex change possible? How should we use sex-tracking pronouns, these third-person singular pronouns in English? What are the ethics of pronouns? We could talk about that. What accommodations, if any, should the law allow? So there's plenty of interesting topics that unfortunately we won't be able to touch on here in these 50 minutes, but in the Q&A, I hope you can join us for that. Okay, I thought I would start by trying to convince you that this matters and try to explain why I got into this. For most audiences, what I tell them is, obviously it matters because we're interested in sex-segregated spaces and activities. So in our society, we segregate a lot of spaces on the basis of sex. Bathrooms obviously come to mind, but also sports teams, prisons, sometimes whole colleges are segregated on the basis of sex. And so in the last several years, it's become very important to be clear on what the sexes are, what it is to be male and what it is to be female, who is allowed in which spaces. So that's basically what we're thinking about. And I'll give you a quotation from a trans-identifying philosopher to illustrate why this is important. So there's a philosopher who goes by the name Veronica Ivy, who is a male who competes in the women's division in cycling, and I found out recently also now in golf. So Veronica Ivy is pictured here. You can probably guess which one. Here's what Veronica Ivy said in 2019 about competing in the women's division. The rules require me to race in the women's category. That's exactly where I belong. I am a woman after all. I am female as well. Trans women are women, What's more, we are female. So I think what we've noticed, certainly in the last 20 years, but especially in the last 5 years, there's been a move to revise so-called gender terms, the meanings of terms like man and woman, but people on the other side of the debate are not content to just revise the meaning of the words man and woman. There's been an effort to revise the meanings of the word male and female as well, so that so-called trans women are not just women, but also female, and so totally eligible to compete in the female division of sports and to access female spaces. Okay, and even more recently, in 2025, this is what the ACLU said about the nature of the sexes, about what it is for something to be a sex. They said the concept of sex refers to multiple physiologic attributes, such as chromosomes, gonads, and anatomy, secondary sex characteristics that usually develop during puberty, and then most importantly, they say, also, one of the things that sex can refer to is gender identity, which is something totally psychological. So this sort of view that the ACLU is expressing would support what Veronica Ivy said. If you identify as a female, you have a so-called female gender identity, then you just are female in a certain sense of the word. That's one way to be female. Okay, so that's one reason why this issue is important, but then I just also added something a little more speculative for a Catholic audience. Let me know what you think about this. So did you know, you probably knew this, but Sister Lucia dos Santos, one of the 3 children involved in the Marian apparitions at Fatima, predicted that the final battle between Christ and Satan would be over marriage and the family. So I'm not trying to claim that we're in the midst of a final battle, but if we're not, it sure looks like we are, right? There's been a lot of debates about the nature of marriage and the family that have been slowly sort of like narrowing in on their subject matter. We've thought about the nature of marriage, whether it's permanent, how many people can be involved in a marriage. We've had debates about contraception, divorce, abortion, and then we've sort of gone more inward and thought about the sexuality of people involved in marriage. Could same-sex marriages, should they be allowed legally? And then more recently, I think this trend has continued, this sort of narrowing trend, and now we're thinking about just what it is to be a man and a woman, what it is to be male and female. And then I guess this is the speculative part. If I were to extrapolate this trajectory, it seems like what's next is just a really frank, controversial discussion about the nature of what it is to be a human. I guess that's the only thing that's left. All right, so that might be happening. So that was my appeal to some Catholic sensibilities to care about this issue. This is very much a live issue in our culture, and it is important to be prepared and to be educated so that if you are called to participate in this battle, you are ready. All right, so let's start with that outline, what the sexes could not be. So some people have said that the sexes are social constructs, not just, certainly many people say that gender is a social construct. The subject tonight is not gender, we're talking about the sexes, but many people have also said that the sexes themselves are social constructs. They're things that we invented, things that we made. So here, for example, is Judith Butler back in 1990 saying this: if the immutable character of sex is contested, perhaps this construct called sex is as culturally constructed as gender. Indeed, perhaps it was always already gender, with the consequence that the distinction between sex and gender turns out to be no distinction at all. It would make no sense then to define gender as the cultural interpretation of sex. That was sort of the dogma at the time. Gender is the social meaning of sex. It's the meaning that we put on the sort of biological reality of sex. So Judith Butler says no, sex itself is a gendered category. Gender ought not to be conceived merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex. Gender must also designate the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established by us. We're the ones who did it. Okay, and then this very year, a couple of young philosophers, Aja Watkins and Marina DeMarco, said sex, like gender, is an organizing construct rather than a biological reality. So it's something that we built, we made in order to organize reality, but it's not itself a part of reality. Okay, so I just want to quickly deal with this sort of view. If you find yourself in a conversation with somebody who thinks something like this, in my experience, it is useful to give a version of this argument that I call the predating argument. Maybe this has already suggested itself in your mind. But obviously, the sexes are very old. They predate any human society. Sexual reproduction has been happening for a long time. Turns out sharks reproduce sexually. You probably knew that. It turns out sharks are very, very old. Like 400, I'm sorry, I didn't know that was funny. But yeah, they're 400 million years old. They're older than trees, which is pretty surprising. I was surprised to learn that. They are older even than the rings of Saturn, it turns out. Sharks are older than the rings of Saturn. Sharks have been around longer than Saturn has had rings. Okay, way before any human society was around. Step 2, if something predates any human society, then it certainly could not have been made by a human society. It's not a social construction. So therefore, sexes are not social constructions. I've had some success with this argument. I think it's a good argument, so I recommend it to you. I think this shows that we did not invent the sexes. Sexual reproduction has been happening for a long time. If somebody denies that there were males and females back then among the sharks before the trees, you should just ask, like, how did they have so many babies? How did they have so many offspring if there weren't males and females? Okay, this one's, I think, more formidable and more widespread and a little more pernicious for that reason. So it's a view that I call the ambiguity hypothesis. I'm going to give you a couple examples of people expressing this hypothesis. The hypothesis is basically that the words we use to pick out the sexes are ambiguous. So words like male and female mean different things. They have multiple meanings. So I'll just give you an example of an ambiguous word. The word mouse is ambiguous. You might mean the little rodent, mammal, mouse, the living organism, or you might mean the computer accessory. So there's an ambiguous word. The claim is that words like male and female are ambiguous in just that way. So here are some people expressing this view. This is Anne Fausto Sterling, who's a pretty big deal in this literature. She says in 2016, the big problem with the term sex in both common and scientific usage is that it has many meanings. And just to prove to you that she's a big deal, there you have just her 4 top papers in terms of citations. She's extremely widely cited, hugely influential in this area. So I'm not like finding somebody who happens to hold this view who's just some random person. No, this is Anne Fausto Sterling, pretty big deal. She says that there are independent types of sex. And if you wonder what these types of sex are, what the different alleged senses of male and female are, you'll often get a list. They'll say, well, an organism might be chromosomally male. That's one sense of the word male. Or hormonally male. Or genitally male, phenotypically male. Recently, you might hear people talking about brain sex. You might have a male brain or a female brain. Okay, so these are alleged senses of the words. Elsewhere, she says these are layers of sex. So I think what she's trying to express is the ambiguity hypothesis. She thinks there are different kinds of sex. The word sex has different meanings. Words like male and female have different meanings. Okay, here's Harry Benjamin, a figure at the foundation of this literature in 1961. He said, instead of the conventional 2 sexes with their anatomical differences, there may be up to 10 or more separate concepts and manifestations of sex, and each could be of vital importance to the individual. Here are some of the kinds of sex I have in mind, and then you get the list. Chromosomal, genetic, anatomical, legal, gonadal, germinal, endocrine / hormonal, psychological, and also the social sex, usually based on the sex of rearing. So for these folks, if you were to just ask, like, is an organism male or female, they'd say you have to be more precise. What are you asking exactly? Are you asking if the organism is hormonally male, chromosomally male? Are you asking whether the individual was raised as a male? These are the alleged different senses of the word sex. Okay, a younger philosopher named Beans Valachi, which, that is a name, and Beans Valachi says, sex is neither static nor unitary in its meaning, And scientists have used multiple meanings of sex for a long time. So there, I think it's a pretty clear expression of the ambiguity hypothesis. Okay, let's evaluate this hypothesis. Fortunately, ambiguity is a linguistic phenomenon that people have a fairly firm grasp on, and linguists have come up with some tests for ambiguity. And we can run these tests on our sex terms, male and female. So here's one test. The test of contradiction would be something like this. If you wanted to test whether a word was ambiguous, you would construct a sentence that has the form of a contradiction, but then ask yourself, can I get a reading of this sentence that is actually possible, that isn't a contradiction? So for example, this sentence, there's a mouse on my desk, but there is no mouse on my desk. There's a mouse on my desk, but there is no mouse on my desk. So it has the form of a contradiction, but because the word mouse is ambiguous, you realize that that could be true. There might be a computer accessory on your desk, but no rodent on your desk, or vice versa. So we can run this test with our sex terms, male and female, and just pick the nearest male named Joe. In the book, I used Joe Biden because he was still president at the time. And he's still alive, so we could use him. And just ask yourself this, is this a contradiction? Joe is male, but he isn't male. Joe is male, but he is not male. So you are competent users of the English language, and you can just check yourself, can I get a true reading of that sentence? And I will just report that I myself cannot get a true reading of that sentence. I think that's like false. So the word male seems to fail this test. This test does not show that the word is ambiguous, because that just sounds like a flat-out contradiction, at least to me. Here's a similar test, a redundancy test. It's basically the same. We just ask, is it redundant to say something like this? There's a mouse on my desk. Also, there's a mouse on my desk. Was that redundant? Did I just give you the same information twice? Well, maybe not, because the word mouse is ambiguous. I might be telling you there's a rodent on my desk, and what's more, there's a computer accessory on my desk. So that's not necessarily redundant. Okay, what if we did it with Joe? Joe is male. Also, Joe is male. So to my ears, that sounds like I just got the same information twice. You did not give me any new information. Okay, I've run this by philosophers, and believe it or not, they weren't super convinced by these tests, because philosophers we're pretty well trained at like hearing possibilities where other people just hear impossibilities. But I think this third test is pretty good. It's my favorite one. It's called conjunction reduction. So here's how the test works. Consider a word like light. That word is ambiguous. It can mean not heavy, as in, for example, the feathers are light. The feathers are not heavy. It can also mean not dark, not dark, like colors, right? So the colors are light, okay. So we could say the feathers are light and the colors are light. Now what if we tried to conjoin those, but use the word light only once? Use the word light only once. So we say the feathers are light, meaning they're not heavy. We say the colors are light, meaning they're not dark. What if we said the feathers and the colors are light? So that sounds a little weird, right? Because your brain's like, I'm not sure how to hear the word light. Are we talking about not heavy, or are we talking about not dark? So because the word's ambiguous, that sounds sort of weird to us. The colors and the feathers are light. Okay, does it sound weird if we do that with our sex terms? So let's name the nearest rooster Gene, and we'll call him Gene because there's a reason. Roosters, their sex is determined like ours genetically. They have a chromosomal system that's different from ours. Their sex chromosomes are either ZZ or ZW. We have XX or XY. They have ZZ or ZW, like other birds. Roosters are actually ZZ. Okay, so Gene is definitely, as these people would say, genetically male. He's chromosomally male. Okay, now name the nearest crocodile, Envo. And we're going to call him Envo because in crocodiles, sex is environmentally determined. And this was news to me when I learned it a few years ago. So every crocodile, when the egg is laid, has all the genetic information required to be either male or female. What makes the difference is the temperature at which the egg is incubated. If it's incubated at a slightly warmer temperature, the crocodile becomes a male. Slightly cooler becomes a female. Okay, so they have no sex chromosomes. They don't have XX chromosomes, XY, ZZ, ZW. They don't have anything like that. No sex chromosomes. but they still have males and females. Okay, so if we say that envo is male, we can't mean chromosomally male, according to these folks. We must mean something like phenotypically male or hormonally male or something like that. Okay, if you're still with me, this is the hardest part of the talk. So, so bear with me just one more minute. This is the hardest part. Okay, so consider the sentence, gene is male. We must be talking about chromosomal maleness. We can stack the sentence so it's clear that's what we're talking about. Envo is male. There we cannot be talking about chromosomal maleness if there is this alleged ambiguity. Let's put them together. Gene and envo are male. Gene and envo are both male. Does that sound weird to you? It doesn't sound weird to me. That sounds totally fine. They are both male. So that suggests that there's no ambiguity here. There's no actual ambiguity here. So we've run 3 common linguistic tests for ambiguity. Our sex terms have failed all of them. Here's a 4th one, which I use the word Aristotle here, so that's good. Adam Sennett, he's a philosopher of language. He calls this the Aristotelian test, so I presume it comes from some part of Aristotle. Please don't ask me which part. But the Aristotelian test is, if you're wondering whether a word is ambiguous or not, try to construct a definition that encompasses both meanings and posit an ambiguity only if you fail. So an ambiguity hypothesis is sort of more complex than the opposite, a hypothesis that the word is univocal, has only one meaning. So we should prefer the simpler hypothesis if it's not necessary to explain any of the data. He uses an example like this. Suppose you meet someone who thinks the word uncle is ambiguous. This person says the word uncle might mean brother of a father, but it also might mean brother of a mother, and those are 2 different senses. Now, obviously, we all think the word's not ambiguous. There's just one more general meaning for the word uncle, and that's just brother of a parent. It doesn't matter if it's a brother of a father or a brother of a mother, as long as it's a brother of a parent, that's an uncle. So that hypothesis is simpler. It explains all the data, so we should prefer it. Okay, we can do something like that with our terms male and female. In fact, it looks like these alleged senses of the words male and female, hormonal male, chromosomal male, phenotypic male, all of these senses actually presuppose a more fundamental sense, one more fundamental sense. Because if you ask these folks, people like Anne Fausto Sterling, I did ask her this once. I don't remember her answer. I should have mentioned that. I don't know what she said. I can't remember what she said. But other folks have answered for me, and when you ask them, what is it to be hormonally male, they'll say something like, to have hormone levels typical of males of that species. What is it to be chromosomally male? Oh, that's to have the sex chromosomes typical of males of that species. Okay, so all of these alleged senses of the word male are actually sort of they're defined in terms of a more fundamental sense. So I think the simpler hypothesis is there's really just one sense, and these other constructions are just sort of wordier ways of talking about different ways that males can be, but we're not talking about different kinds of males. Okay, that's it for the ambiguity hypothesis. Let's talk about contextualism. So this is another popular view. We owe it to a gender studies theorist and philosopher at Harvard, Sarah Richardson, who tells us sex contextualism is this view. It's the view that the definition of sex and sex-related variables, and whether they're relevant in biomedical research, depends on the research context. Okay, elsewhere she's a little teeny tiny bit clearer. She says, according to sex contextualism, there is no such thing as sex itself. There is no such thing as sex itself. Rather, there is only sex as pragmatically constituted in an observational frame. That is difficult to understand. Here are some people trained in philosophy who try to explain what this means. They are not themselves contextualists, but Maximiliana Rifkin and Justin Garson say this is what sex contextualism is, and this helped me understand the view. It's the view, according to them, that there's no single universal definition of, for example, maleness. Rather, what happens is scientists must operationalize maleness in different ways, in different research contexts. In some contexts, maleness will be operationalized in terms of hormones, in others, genetics, and still others, behavior. Okay, well, if you're like me, you have to figure out what operationalization is. So I looked it up, and turns out what they mean is when you're conducting research, when you're designing a study, you have to decide how you're going to measure some quantity or some variable that you're interested in. So maybe Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones are interested in measuring job satisfaction at some company. They work for some consulting firm. They've been hired to figure out how satisfied the workers are. One of them decides to operationalize job satisfaction in this way. They're going to use surveys. They're going to ask people, how do you like your job? So that's how they decide to measure job satisfaction. They have now operationalized job satisfaction. They've produced some operation you could perform to measure job satisfaction. Maybe Dr. Jones does it differently. He says, I'm going to look at retention rates. So I'll look at quit rates. I'll see how easy it is to retain people and recruit people, and that's how we'll measure job satisfaction. Okay, so that's what it is to operationalize some variable that you're interested in. Now here's the catch. This is the problem for contextualism. In order for these studies to be about the same thing, job satisfaction must have some shared meaning across the studies. That's why Dr. Smith can talk to Dr. Jones about these studies and say, oh no, we got inconsistent results. My results showed that the people are very satisfied with their jobs. And Dr. Jones might say, oh, my results showed they're not satisfied with their jobs. They must be talking about the same thing. There must be some shared meaning of job satisfaction, even though it's been operationalized in different ways. All right, I think the same thing's going with sex and biological research. The same thing's going on with sex and biological research. Different researchers might operationalize sex differently. Maybe one of them says, for the purposes of my study, I'm going to sort the subjects into males and females, and I'll do that with a chromosome test. So I'm just going to test chromosomes to figure out who's male and who's female. Maybe somebody else measures hormone levels. Another researcher looks at secondary sex characteristics or something like that. Still, in order for these studies to be about the same thing, the word sex, the word male, the word female must have a shared meaning across these research studies. Okay, so there is such a thing as sex itself, and it's that. It's whatever this shared meaning is. Okay, so I think the contextualists are mistaken. One more view that's wrong, I think. It's a view of semantic indeterminacy. So let me tell you what that means. That's a pretty fancy word. Here's what it means. The view is just, there are no facts that determine what male and female refer to. It is indeterminate what the words refer to. We thought we were referring to one particular phenomenon, but then we did some research, found out it's really complicated, and there's no one thing for the words to refer to. Okay, instead, there's just a range of equally eligible candidates that each word might refer to. And here, I think, is a philosopher, another trans-identifying philosopher who I think expresses this view. Talia Becher says, once we recognize various features which go into sex determination, and there's the list again, chromosomal sex, gonadal sex, genital sex, etc., we see that sex is not a single, unitary, easily determined feature. Now, I admit it's not super clear exactly what this philosopher is saying there, but I think it might be an expression of this indeterminacy thesis. Let me give you a concrete example that I think will help understand this. This is based on real life. This is a real life example from my daughter. So we had a male bunny in our front yard back when we lived in Ojai. We had a female bunny in our backyard, and my daughter thought it would be a great idea to get them together and produce some babies. So that's what we did. We let them get together. It wasn't super clear whether the operation was successful, and then we separated them again. And then sometime later, we looked out in the backyard where the female bunny was, and she had a little burrow, and we saw the cutest little baby bunny popping out of there. And we were like, oh, it looks like there's a little baby bunny. And then the next day, we see a baby bunny outside the burrow again, looks exactly the same. Okay, now suppose we had done this. Suppose we'd said, that is so great, there's a little baby bunny in our backyard. Let's name the baby bunny Buns, or something like that. Let's name the baby bunny Buns. Now suppose that what was going on is, I don't know if you can see this picture, but there's like one bunny outside the burrow. This was in the early days of AI. I used AI to make this picture. I cheated in making the picture. So there's a little bunny outside the burrow, and then there's another little bunny inside the burrow, and that's what was happening to us. There were two baby bunnies, and they were taking turns coming outside the burrow, but they looked exactly the same. Okay, question. There were only two, thank goodness. Which of those baby bunnies was Buns? To which one did the name Buns refer? What did the name Buns pick out? Well, it's tough. You don't want to say one and not the other, because we thought there was only one when we introduced the name. We said, let the name Buns refer to the baby bunny in our backyard. So it would be kind of arbitrary to choose one and not the other. You don't want to say both. You don't want to say that Buns is actually like spatially dislocated and occupying different places in space at the same time. But you don't want to say neither either, because it seems like we did name something in the backyard. Okay, so this would be a case of semantic indeterminacy. We've got a word, in this case a name, and it doesn't look like there's any determinate fact of the matter about what it refers to. Okay, now the theorists who express this view, I think, have the same sort of thing in mind. They think that we believed there was one phenomenon that we were naming with male, but then we opened the hood, so to speak, and just found this mess of chromosomes and hormones and secondary sex characteristics. There was no one thing answering to the name male, so it is just indeterminate what the word male refers to. All right, problem. On the contrary, there are most eligible candidates for the reference of words like sex and male and female. There simply are most eligible candidates. It's not like the Buns case. It's not like the case where we open the hood and it's just super complicated underneath. Okay, and here's the evidence. There are males and females in other species, despite having no relevant overlap with human males and females when it comes to chromosomes, hormones, genitals, brains, social roles, etc. There are male nematodes, which are just super basic little worms, but they're male. And I'm a male too. There are also male plants, like there are date plants. If you've eaten dates, some date plants are male, some date plants are female. So yeah, there are male date plants, just like me, I'm a male, and the date plants are male. So we must have something in common that makes us both male, and it doesn't have to, we don't share any relevant facts about our chromosomes, hormones, genitals, brains, social roles, etc. So none of those aren't equally eligible candidates compared to this one, which is some feature that we have related to gamete production. The male nematode and I have something in common related to the production of certain kinds of sex cells, namely sperm. Females across the plant and animal kingdom have in common the production of ova, or eggs. That's what all females have in common, and only the females. That's what all males have in common, the production of sperm. Okay, so that's the problem for indeterminacy. It does look like there is a most eligible candidate. If you just keep track of how biologists are using the word male and female across the plant and animal kingdoms, it looks like they're referring to something like this. Okay, so let's develop that sort of view. What is this relation to gamete production that is the nature of the sexes? So I call it a higher order functional account in the book. But for you, I call it a Neo-Aristotelian theory because it does have its roots in Aristotle. Look what I found. In the generation of animals, fortunately there were some margin notes that helped me find the fundamental distinction between male and female. I was like, okay. That's what I'm looking for, perfect. And there it is, according to Aristotle. The male and the female are distinguished by a certain ability and inability. Okay, so males have a certain ability. They're able to concoct, to cause to take shape, and to discharge semen. Females, lower down, female is that which receives the semen but is unable to cause semen to take shape or to discharge it. Okay, so for Aristotle, the distinction between the sexes is defined in terms of abilities and inabilities, capacities. Okay, so I think that's on the right track. And, he didn't know about sperm and eggs back then, but he was doing his best with what he knew. And also, this is kind of fun. This isn't necessary for our purposes, but it's sort of funny. He goes on to say, all concoction works by means of heat. Assuming the truth of these two statements, it follows of necessity that male animals are hotter than female ones. Which I thought that was good. Okay. I was hearing that about temperature. I don't know how you were hearing that, but I thought this was like confirming a kind of stereotype that's relatively common and that seems confirmed by a lot of observations in the fall months. You know what I'm talking about, during fall and winter? So yeah, one wonders if Aristotle's wife just liked blankets during the fall and winter months. And so he's like, I guess males are hotter than female ones. Okay. So let's try to refine this view. I don't think this view is, it needs a little help. So this is the view. A male is an organism with the ability, let's just put sperm in there instead of semen. A male is an organism with the ability to produce sperm. A female is an organism with the inability to produce sperm. So I don't think that's quite right because there are a lot of organisms that are unable to produce sperm but are not females. Okay, so we're going to have to fix this a little bit. He didn't know about eggs. So let's fix it and say, is this better? Let's say a male is an organism with the ability to produce sperm. Females themselves have an ability. It's a different kind of ability. They produce eggs. Okay, I think even this is kind of a problem. This is a view that in the book I call the active capacity view. It's a view on which to be male what's required to be male is to be doing something right now. You have to be actively producing sperm. To be a female, you have to be doing something right now, actively producing eggs. So I don't think that can quite be right because scientists very often describe embryos as male or female. Juvenile males are male, but do not yet have this ability. And of course, humans can be victims of all sorts of injury and diseases and malfunctions, and yet still be male or female. And not just humans, but organisms all over the plant and animal kingdoms. Okay, so I don't think this active capacity view is going to work. What I would recommend instead is, instead of thinking that the nature of sexes is defined in terms of abilities or capacities, we should define it in terms of functions, which I think is also very at home in an Aristotelian worldview. So this is an updated Aristotelian view. It's a Neo-Aristotelian view. That just means it's new. It's the new Aristotelian view. So I think this is the truth of the matter, in case you were wondering. This is the truth of the matter. A male is an organism with the function of producing sperm. A female is an organism with the function of producing eggs. That's the bumper sticker version. That's the slogan. But it's good enough for government work. Literally, as we'll see in a second. Yeah, okay, I'll show you in a second. Remember I said that. Here's a more careful statement. More carefully, the sexes are actually a certain kind of function. It's a higher order function. And these functions have to be what I call activated. So I'm just going to quickly tell you what I mean by those terms. What is it for a function to be activated? What is it for a function to be a higher order function? Here's what it is for a function to be a higher order function. I think some organisms have the function of producing components, and those components themselves have functions. So part of the human design plan is to produce a liver, and livers have a function. Part of our design plan is to produce a heart. That's a component, and our heart has a function. Another part of the human design plan is to produce reproductive organs, and those have functions. All right, so if you're a human with a function of producing a certain component that has the function of producing eggs, you're a female. If you have the function of producing a component that has the function of producing sperm, you're a male. Okay, functions, I think you can think of them as conditionals. They just are conditionals. So you might wonder, what is a function? I think it's just a conditional. It's a fact about an organism or an artifact that can be expressed as a if-then statement. And what's in the if clause is a specification of the state that the thing is in, the organism or the artifact, what sort of input it has received, and what sort of output will be produced if the thing is functioning properly. Okay, I'll give you some examples. I know that's super abstract. I'll give you a concrete example on the next slide. Okay, and a function is activated when the if clause is true, when the thing, the artifact or the organism is in that state and has received that input, the function is activated. So in the absence of malfunction and in a congenial kind of environment, the output will be produced. All right, so that's an activated higher order function. Here's an example. I am sorry, this is a dated example. I am a middle-aged man, and when I was young, we had remotes like this. We didn't have a jumbo remote, but we had these sort of remotes. Do you still have remotes? I honestly don't know. Do you recognize this, and you know what a VCR is? Okay, great. So here's an example of artifact that has functions, and it has a lot of functions. I'm just going to tell you about 3 of them. We can express them as conditionals. Here's one of them. If the system is in a certain state, the TV is off, and then you push the TV button, and then you push the power button, then the output that should be produced, if the thing's functioning properly, and nothing's in the way, the environment's okay, the output that will be produced is the TV goes on. All right, so that's a function of the remote. Here's another one. If the TV's on, and then you push that volume plus button, then the TV volume is going to increase one increment. So that's one of the functions of this remote. One more, if the TV and the VCR are both on, the VCR was like an early smartphone. That's what we had instead of smartphones. You would put little cartridges in there, and then you could it would scroll for you, and then you could watch shows. So if the TV and VCR are both on, and then you push the VCR button, so you put it in another mode, it's now in VCR mode, and then you push the power button, VCR goes off. Not TV, but VCR. Okay, you get the idea. Here's something I know less about. Maybe some of you know about this. This is a sheet metal machine. Although I don't know much about it, you'll understand why I use it as an example in a second, but I guess this machine has functions as well. It bends sheet metal, so if you wanted to make a frame for like a vending machine or something, you'd take some flat sheet metal and put it in this machine and then probably turn that crank, and then the sheet metal bends. Okay, so this would have functions as well. I didn't spell them out, but surely this has functions. Okay. Now follow me in this analogy. Suppose we have a factory. There we are on the floor of the factory, and we're setting up this factory. It's a new factory. And what we're trying to produce with this factory, we're trying to produce vending machines. So we're looking at the factory plans in our hands. We've got like the blueprint of the factory, and we realize in order to complete this factory, the plans call for a certain component. We need to have a sheet metal machine there in order to bend the frame for the vending machine. We've got to put the sheet metal machine right there. Okay, so then this factory has functions, and some of the functions of the factory are higher order functions. The plan of the factory calls for the development and maintenance of a component, the sheet metal machine, that itself has a function, bending sheet metal. Okay. You can probably see where I'm going, or maybe not. Did you expect that? So here's a chicken. This is a hen. So it's like a factory. Hens are like factories. They're little egg factories. They are composed of a variety of components, and those components have functions. And to say that this is a female chicken is to say that the genetic plan of this chicken calls for the development and maintenance of a certain component that itself has a function, ovaries. Okay, now it's a female because it has that higher order function. And if that function was activated, which it is in utero, in species where the sex is determined genetically, then we've got a female chicken from the jump. Even before the factory is set up, so to speak, even when it's an embryo, it is a female embryo because it's got this activated higher order function to produce a component that produces eggs. And it will do if you just wait long enough. And there's no malfunction. Okay. So yeah, I think that we can collapse the more complicated definition to the simpler definition. We can just truly say to be a male is to have the function of producing sperm, to be a female is to have the function of producing eggs. And that's because these higher order function ascriptions collapse. So we can truly say of the factory, we can say this is a factory that produces vending machines. That's true. It's also a factory that bends sheet metal. That's something that the factory does. It does it by maintaining this component that bends sheet metal, but that's something that the factory does, and if it's functioning properly, the factory will do that. Okay, so you can collapse the higher order function ascriptions to the simpler statement, so we can do that in the case of males and females as well. To be a female is to have the function of producing eggs. To be a male is to have the function of producing sperm. I said that was good enough for government work. Here's why. Hey, I recently had the privilege. Okay, this is a brag. I'm bragging now, and I'm sorry. But did you know that we got a new president in January, and one of his early executive orders was commanding the Department of Health and Human Services to come up with definitions of male, female, man and woman, sex, and so on. Okay, that happened. You might have missed it. I noticed it. And HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, reached out to several biologists and philosophers, and I was one of them, and a big win for me was getting some function talk into the definition. So that's nice. Yeah, okay, thanks. So I was going to say that's now the law of the land, but it's not really a law. It's just the executive order of the land, I guess. We'll see how long it lasts. Also, the Heritage Foundation took that definition on and put it in their model legislation for states, so we might see that sort of language show up in various state laws, which would be cool. Okay, let's talk about objections. We have 5 minutes, maybe. I don't know. It's been 45 minutes. Let's see how many objections we get through. Okay, the first objection has to do with embryos and juveniles. So here's how the objection goes. Somebody might object to this way. If you defend this sort of function-based view, you'll probably hear these first two objections most commonly. So people might say, look, embryos and juveniles don't have the function of producing any gametes at all. Well, I guess juvenile females do. I should have said juvenile males do not have the function of producing sperm. Embryos definitely don't have the function of producing any gametes at all. They're just too small. The embryos are too small. But they can nevertheless be male or female. Scientists often describe embryos as male or female. Juvenile males are male. So being male or female does not really require having the function that you said was necessary to be male or female. That's the objection. Okay, so here's the reply. I do admit that embryos and juveniles lack any first-order function of producing gametes. It's true that there's nothing you could do to the embryo to get it right now to produce gametes. No matter what you offered the embryo, there's simply no way it could do it. So they do lack that first-order function. They do lack that capacity. But I agree that those organisms do have sexes. But so long as this condition is met, their genetic plan specifies the development of components that produce either ova or sperm, and this function is activated. And I think that is the case. That is precisely the case with embryos and juvenile males. So, according to this higher order function account that I was proposing, embryos and juveniles can be male or female, despite lacking that first order function. As long as they have the activated higher order function, which they do, they can be male or female. So the premise that I'm rejecting in that objection is the first one, the claim that embryos and juveniles don't have the function of producing gametes. They do have the relevant activated higher order function. They do have the right kind of function. Okay, next objection, disease, injury, and malfunction. I think probably this one's actually the most common. This is the one you'll probably hear most if you defend this sort of view in public. I hear it all the time. So if you say, look, I think males have the function of producing sperm, females have the function of producing eggs, the first thought that comes into a lot of people's mind is not all males and not all females. So the objection goes like this, and this is actually Judith Butler giving the objection very recently in 2024. She says, she's a pretty big deal in the literature too, if you didn't know about Judith Butler. Very, very big deal in this literature. She says, if reproductive capacity defines one's sex, then one loses that sex or never arrives at that sex if one cannot or does not engage in that kind of sexual reproduction. So I think she'd say something similar about the claim that, well, what's really required is a certain kind of reproductive capacity, the function of producing sperm or eggs. Okay, so the objection is something like this. Many organisms cannot produce gametes due to disease, injury, etc. Yet at least some of these are male or female. So being male or female doesn't really require having the function of producing gametes. That's the objection. Here's my response. An organism may have the higher order function of developing and maintaining a component with the function of producing sperm, and therefore be a male. And that function may be activated, even if we damage or remove some component or subsystem required for the production of sperm. So even if the testes are removed, you still have a male. It would be like in our factory that has the function of developing and maintaining the sheet metal machine. That would still be true. That factory still has the function of bending sheet metal, even if some maniac comes in with a sledgehammer and smashes our sheet metal machine. This factory would just be unable to fulfill its function. It's supposed to have a sheet metal machine there, but somebody destroyed the sheet metal machine. Nevertheless, it still has that function. So that's just the way functions work. Functions can exist even if they're not fulfilled. And when you think about it, the examples multiply themselves. Your car has a variety of functions. One of the functions is to like blink when you hit the little blinker stick. What's it called? The turn indicator stick. You know what I'm talking about. That's what it's supposed to do. It has that function. It's supposed to indicate when you're turning, but if the bulb is burnt out, it's not going to be able to fulfill that function. That doesn't mean it doesn't have the function. It is malfunctioning. It is supposed to blink, but because one of the components has been damaged, it's unable to fulfill the function. Okay, same thing is happening with disease and injury and malfunction generally. Okay, so what I'm denying is the inference here. I think, yeah, many organisms cannot produce gametes due to injury, disease, etc. That is true. And at least some of these are male or female. That's true as well. But it doesn't follow that they don't have the function to produce these gametes. It is possible to have a function and yet not fulfill it. Okay, let's talk. Okay, I think it's fine. We can probably get through all of this if that's okay. Let's talk about environmental sex determination. Those are the crocodiles, if you remember them. Their sex depends on the temperature at which the egg is incubated. So somebody might worry that every crocodile has both the function of producing testes and also the function of producing ovaries. They have all the genetic information required. If you looked at the blueprint of a little crocodile in the egg, it's got all the information required to be male or female. So wouldn't we have to say then that every crocodile is actually a simultaneous hermaphrodite, both male and female at the same time? That would be a bad result. Okay, quick response. And this is why I added the bit about activated functions. I was reflecting on crocodiles, and that's what led me to add the activated bit. So I think the crocodile's genetic plan just allows for the development of either testes or ovaries. That function is on what you might call the machine table of every little baby crocodile. They do have the higher order function. It is ready to go. But only one of those gets activated, and it requires an environmental stimulus in order to activate the function. All right, so yeah, that's what I say. An environmental input is required to activate one of these functions to satisfy the antecedent of the function conditional to make that if clause true. Okay, so I think the thing to say is this is going to happen once at the time of incubation, and at that point, from that point on, each crocodile has only one sex, which is the right result. Surprising result, but upon reflection, I think this is the right result. The thing to say before incubation happens is the crocodile in the egg has no sex yet, which is a little weird, but I think it's the right thing to say because what are we going to say? Is it actually male or is it female? It hasn't been determined yet by the environment. So I think the thing to say is it doesn't have a sex until it gets that environmental input, and then it has exactly one sex. Okay, shall we talk about hermaphrodites for a little while? All right, here we go. Did you know that there are simultaneous hermaphrodites? And somebody might object to my view in this way, and I don't know, maybe you're thinking about this if you've never thought about hermaphrodites before. I don't blame you. You might object in this way. You might, upon learning that many organisms produce both sperm and eggs, that might occasion in your mind an objection. Oh my goodness, there's one right there. Did you know every garden snail is a simultaneous hermaphrodite, can produce both eggs and sperm, does produce both eggs and sperm? Yeah, don't look up Google Images for snail reproduction because you can't unsee it. So don't do it. But I guess the theory is they move so slowly that they had to get the most bang for their buck whenever they met up with another snail, so to speak. And so they do a dual exchange. Like, I'll give you some sperm, you give me some sperm, here's some eggs. Okay, so that's how snails work, and those are the facts. So if you think this, hey look, male and female are opposites. There's just no way that something could be male and female at the same time. That's insane. Then you'll conclude, okay, then having the function of producing certain gametes isn't really sufficient for being male or female. If it were, then these snails would be both male and female at the same time. That's impossible. Nothing can be male and female at the same time. So maybe you can guess my response. Things can be male and female at the same time, and this is something we have to come to terms with. We have to make our peace with this fact. Some organisms are both male and female. Garden snails are one such example. So there are biologists who sometimes list hermaphrodites as a third sex, but I think that's a mistake. I think the right thing to say of a simultaneous hermaphrodite is it is male, it is also female at the same time. So I think the activated higher order function definition can account for that. Just remember what the definitions are. A male is an organism with the activated function of producing a component with a function of producing sperm. And similarly with females and ova. Males have the function of producing sperm. Females have the function of producing eggs. It is possible for something to have both of these functions. It's like that jumbo remote. That has multiple functions. You can have organisms that have multiple functions, and the snail is one of them. The snail has both of these functions. All right. Let's talk about sequential hermaphrodites. And there's one right there. Found him. There he is. That is a clownfish, made famous in the movie Finding Nemo. Okay, so did you know clownfish are sequential hermaphrodites? And my understanding is most of the sequential hermaphrodites in nature are fish of one variety or another. So a sequential hermaphrodite is an organism that can go from being male to being female, or vice versa. And some of them can change teams more than once in their lifetimes. For some of them, you get one team change and that's it. Some of them can change teams more than once. Okay, so here's what I think we should say about sequential hermaphrodites. So I say, return again to our universal remote control with two modes or states, television mode and auxiliary mode, or VCR mode if you like. The power button features in two function conditionals of this remote control, depending on what mode the remote control is in. You could put it in TV mode, and then the power button turns on the TV. You can put it in auxiliary mode or VCR mode, and then the power button turns on the VCR. Okay, these functions cannot be activated simultaneously if it's the kind of remote where you have to toggle the internal states. The best you can do is activate the functions sequentially. You can either be in TV mode or change something and then be in VCR mode. So I think that's basically what sequential hermaphrodites are doing. They do have both of the higher order functions encoded in their genes, but unlike the crocodile that needs to get one of those functions activated by the environment, these guys, these little fish, can toggle back and forth. They can activate one of the functions at some points in their life and then deactivate it, activate a different function at another point in their life. So this activated higher order function account of the sexes can explain what's going on with sequential hermaphrodites. Okay, how about 3 minutes? Let's do 3 minutes. There's just 2 left. Don't you want to finish this? I kind of want to finish it, yeah. Don't you want to get to the end? Okay, so-called intersex conditions. Just FYI, my understanding is the community of people who have these conditions, many of them now prefer that they be called differences or disorders of sexual development rather than intersex conditions. So here's one objection that people often have in mind when they raise these sorts of conditions. They'll say, look, there are certain conditions of human females who lack the activated higher order function of producing eggs. They don't have the function of producing eggs, but they're females. So having that activated higher order function isn't really required for being female. And the example I give you here is a condition called Swyer syndrome. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a condition that affects people who have XY chromosomes, but there's a very important gene on the Y chromosome, the SRY gene, that is required for initiating the cascade of male development. And that is either broken, the gene is present but non-functional, or it's absent altogether. Okay, so what happens is then the cascade of male development doesn't start, and you end up with an individual who looks very much like a female. On the outside, you have a lot of the secondary sex characteristics that we associate with females. And a lot of these individuals believe that they're female until around their 13th birthday or 14th birthday, they go to a doctor and they discover there are no internal ovaries. There are just internal, well, I guess in this case there would be no functional gonads at all. No testes, no ovaries. All right. So that's Swyer syndrome. And so what a lot of people say is, look, obviously this is from the Oprah Winfrey Show, and this individual has Swyer syndrome. So people will say, obviously this is a female, just look, but this female doesn't have the activated higher order function of producing eggs. This individual is XY. Okay, so that's the objection. Well, that's one objection that you might get that deal with so-called intersex conditions. Another objection, you probably can't see this figure at all, but it's sort of an infamous figure from Scientific American. Somebody drew this to try to show, I think it was around the year 2000, I might be wrong, to try to show that sex is actually a spectrum. Sex is a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have, on the left end, you have typical biological females. On the right end, you have typical biological males. And then what they're trying to map is all the disorders of sexual development and what the resulting individual will look like. And then the conclusion is, oh, look, sex is actually a spectrum. So that's step one, intersex cases prove sex is a spectrum, but if the Neo-Aristotelian account is right, there are really only two sexes. There's not really a spectrum of sexes, so the Neo-Aristotelian account must be wrong. Okay, here's a quick response. Okay, I don't want to scandalize anybody. I'm just talking about logical possibilities, the logical possibilities for any organism, including humans. I don't think there are actually any cases of true simultaneous hermaphrodites among humans. I don't think that can happen given the way that our male and female developmental pathways are mutually destructive. There are some alleged cases in the literature, but it's not super clear that they're genuine cases. All right, but it is a logical possibility, just given the definition of what it is to be male and what it is to be female. It is possible for an organism to be only male, only female, both male and female, like a garden snail, or neither. There are organisms that are neither male nor female, like bacteria and fungi, etc. Okay, so it may be unclear which of those is true. And I think that's what happens in some cases of disorders of sexual development. Sometimes it's unclear whether the individual is male or female. But that often happens in biology. Sometimes it's unclear if we discover a new organism, whether it's a herbivore or a carnivore or an omnivore. That might be unclear. It might be unclear whether some new organism we discover is a mammal. That sometimes happens. Most of our biological concepts allow for unclear cases. Okay, but in order to get a clear counterexample to our definition, we'd have to have a disorder of sexual development in which the individual is clearly male and clearly lacks the relevant function, or vice versa, or clearly female and clearly lacks the function to produce eggs, or vice versa. But I don't think any of these cases are cases like that. And I'll just, with regard to Swyer syndrome, I'll just point out that it is totally possible for an individual to look female and yet not actually be female. That can happen. And we know it happens elsewhere in the animal kingdom. I don't know if you're familiar with bluegills. They're like little fish that occupy like ponds and lakes. I think around here. I feel like I've seen bluegills before. But there's a whole strategy, a whole reproductive strategy that some males have where they develop so as to resemble females. Some of them are called they're sneaker males. They look like females, so there's a male that's supposed to be guarding the female, but then here comes another female, and the male's like, go ahead, you may pass. And then the sneaker male gets in there and has children, has little children fish with the female. Okay, so I think that's what's happening in a lot of these cases. So with regard to the first objection, the claim was there are females who lack the relevant function of producing eggs. I don't think that's true. I think if you reflect on the case, you'll realize probably Swyer syndrome is a case of, it affects males. Okay, so that's the part I would want to deny in the first objection. Second objection, I don't think intersex cases prove that sex is a spectrum. Upon reflection, what we realize is there's really just 4 ways to combine the sexes, but there are only 2 sexes. There is no third sex. There are only 2 sexes. There is no third sex. All right, I'm going to do this just for the sake of completion. It's going to be fast. Postmenopausal females, this is something that philosophers worry about, believe it or not. And what they say is, look, postmenopausal females aren't producing eggs anymore. They don't have the function of producing eggs. All the eggs are gone, in humans anyway. So that function is not required for being female. We've got females here that don't have the function of producing eggs. All right, counterexample. So there are 2 kinds of responses that I think can be given to this sort of case. One is you might think that menopause is an adaptation. It was actually a winning sort of reproductive strategy. This is called the grandmother hypothesis. It was a winning evolutionary strategy to invest one's resources in one's grandchildren after a certain stage of life. So if that's the case, then what's happening is programmed deactivation. The relevant higher order function is there, but the component is being deactivated. So if it is adaptive for the ovary's function to be deactivated later in life, it's still true to say of a menopausal woman that she has the activated higher order function of developing and maintaining ovaries, even if the ovary's function is deactivated. So she remains female. Just to use the factory analogy one last time, promise I'm almost done. Thank you for your attention so far. I know this is going on for a while. It's to use the factory analogy one more time. It's like if we were going on vacation, and so to save some energy, I don't know if sheet metal machines require electricity. Now that I mention it, but suppose we turn it off. So we have deactivated the component, like it no longer can bend sheet metal, but the factory still has the function of producing a component that has the function of producing sheet metal, and that function for the factory is still activated, even if the component's function is being deactivated. So I think that's one thing that might be going on with postmenopausal females. Okay, the last possibility is it's just straight up degeneration. This happens to males too. Later in life, it's an effective aging. Happens to our eyes. Our eyes slowly lose their ability to fulfill their function later in life. And so what we should say in that case is, even if the ovaries are malfunctioning due to age, it's still true to say of a menopausal woman that she has the activated higher order function of developing and maintaining ovaries, so she remains female. Okay, so either way there, we don't have a counterexample. So postmenopausal women are females, but they do have the relevant activated higher order function that this theory proposes is necessary. All right, the end. Wait. Just wanted to quickly remind you, there are still a lot of spicy topics to discuss, and we can do that in the Q&A. We can talk about whether sex is binary, although I just told you there's only two. We could talk about whether sex change is possible, medically feasible. We could think about that. We could talk about the ethics of pronouns, or maybe some political questions, like what sort of accommodation should the law allow. So I encourage you to attend the Q&A. It's a great opportunity to watch some sparks fly as iron sharpens iron. It's a great exercise of your philosophical abilities. I hope to see you there, and thank you for your attention. I don't know what to do. Do I leave? Should I just walk out? Okay. Oh, thanks.